So now we begin our exploration of the integumentary system. The integumentary system consists of the skin or the integument and some subcutaneous tissues. We're going to be examining the functions of the skin, the epidermal layer, as well as the dermal layer, and a supporting layer beneath that called the hypodermis. We'll examine thick skin and thin skin, as well as skin color and skin markings. Other portions of the integumentary system include hair, nails, cutaneous glands. And then we'll look at some skin disorders towards the end of the chapter. The integumentary system consists of the skin and all of its accessory organs. It's your hair, nails, and cutaneous glands. It's the most visible system that we have. We pay a lot of attention to this organ system. Not many of us go out of the house without looking in the mirror to check our skin and our hair. Also, inspection of the skin and hair and nails is a significant part of a physical examination. The skin can tell us a lot about the health of an individual. Skin is also the most vulnerable organ. It's exposed to radiation, trauma, infection, and injurious chemicals. Dermatology is the scientific study and medical treatment of the integumentary system. Skin is the body's largest and heaviest organ. It covers an area of 1.5 to 2 meters squared in the average person, and it constitutes about 15% of the body weight. There are two primary layers, the epidermis, which is composed of stratified squamous epithelium, and the dermis, which is the connective tissue layer below. You can see them separated nicely in this figure here. The epidermal layer is relatively thin compared to the dermis. We'll also explore another connective tissue layer below the dermis called the hypodermis. It's mostly fatty tissue and contains a lot of the cutaneous vessels. Most skin is only about 1 to 2 millimeters thick. However, it ranges from about half a millimeter on the eyelids to about 6 millimeters when we look between the shoulder blades. There are two basic types of skin. There's thick skin, which we'll see on the palms and the soles of our feet, and thin skin, which covers the rest of the body. Now, thick and thin doesn't really have anything to do with its thickness or thinness. It just has to do with an additional layer that we're going to see coming up soon. The thick skin that we find on our palms and the soles of our feet and fingers and toes has sweat glands but no hair follicles or sebaceous glands. The epidermis of that is about half a millimeter thick. Thin skin covers the whole rest of the body. This is the skin that possesses hair follicles, sebaceous glands, and sweat glands, and the epidermis there is only going to be about 1.1 millimeter thick. The skin has many functions. First of all, its resistance to trauma and infection. It has a high content of the protein keratin, which allows it to be very strong, and its cells are held together by very strong desmosomes. Very few infectious organisms can penetrate the intact skin. It's covered with bacteria and fungi that colonize its surface, but their numbers are kept in check by this acid mantle. The acid mantle maintains a pH of about 4 to 6. It has a very protective function. The skin has other barrier functions like waterproofing and protection from UV radiation and harmful chemicals. Not only does the skin prevent water from leaving and dehydrating us, but it prevents water from seeping in also. The skin blocks much of the cancer-causing radiation from ultraviolet radiation, prevents it from reaching the deeper tissue layers. The skin is also involved in vitamin D synthesis. There are 3 steps to the synthesis of vitamin D, which is a crucial vitamin. The first step happens in the skin where cholesterol is converted by ultraviolet radiation into an early form of vitamin D. The liver and kidneys will complete this process. We'll investigate that in much more detail later this semester. Obviously, the skin provides us with a lot of sensation. The skin is our most extensive sense organ. It's embedded with many different sensory cells. The skin's involved in thermoregulation, contains a lot of thermoreceptors, and thus allows vasoconstriction and vasodilation of the vessels in the skin. When the vessels vasoconstrict, we're holding blood more towards the center of the body and thus losing less heat. When the vessels vasodilate, we'll see that the skin gets more heat and blood supply, and thus will lose more heat to the environment. The skin is definitely involved in nonverbal communication, as we have facial muscles and can have a variety of different expressions exhibited in the pictures below. The skin is also involved in transdermal absorption, that is, absorption of substances like certain drugs that can come steadily through the skin. We'll see people use nicotine patches when they're trying to quit smoking, or birth control patches in order to deliver birth control across the skin. The skin also has a huge function in cleansing. When we sweat, we lose a lot of other chemicals across the skin. Let's begin by looking at the epidermis. The epidermis is composed of keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. The cells at the surface are dead and they're packed with this tough protein called keratin. This layer lacks blood vessels, so it depends on diffusion of nutrients from the underlying connective tissues. And there are sparse nerve endings for touch and pain located in the epidermis. There are 5 types of cells in the epidermis. First of all, there are stem cells. This is a great picture to be familiar with. The stem cells are undifferentiated cells that can give rise only to keratinocytes. They're the deepest layer of the epidermis, called the stratum basal. Then we'll see keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are the great majority of epidermal cells. These are the ones that synthesize keratin. Pretty much all the cells you see in here in purple are keratinocytes. We'll also see melanocytes. We can see melanocytes right here. They occur only in the stratum basal, this very lowest layer. They synthesize the pigment melanin. Melanin's involved in shielding the DNA from ultraviolet radiation. The branched processes of the melanocytes can spread among the keratinocytes and pass their melanin on. We'll also see tactile Merkel cells, shown here in blue. These are touch receptor cells, and they're associated with dermal nerve fibers and transmit information about touch. We'll also see dendritic Langerhans cells, like this big cell in green right here. These are macrophages. They originate in the bone marrow, and they move out into the epithelial layers and guard against pathogens. They're found in the stratum spinosum and the stratum granulosum. They run around and gobble up all the trash. So now let's look at the different layers of the epidermis. The stratum basal is a single layer of stem cells and keratinocytes that rests on the basement membrane. It also contains melanocytes and tactile cells. They're scattered among the stem cells and keratinocytes. The stem cells of the stratum basal are going to divide and give rise to all these keratinocytes that are in purple. They migrate towards the skin's surface and replace lost epidermal cells. So there's a constant supply of new cells being generated from the stratum basal, pushing up and replacing cells that are being lost from the surface. So constant regeneration of the epidermal cells. The stratum spinosum is the next layer up. The stratum spinosum is the thickest layer. It consists of several layers of keratinocytes. The deep cells are going to remain capable of mitosis, and they cease dividing as they're pushed upwards, and they become more and more filled with keratin filaments. This causes the cells to flatten out and have the squamous appearance. Remember that we name the cells based on the cells at the apical surface. So this is stratified squamous epithelium because the squamous cells are at the apical surface. Dendritic cells are found throughout the stratum spinosum. We'll also see numerous desmosomes holding the cells together. The next layer up is the stratum granulosum. It consists of 3 to 5 layers of flat keratinocytes. These all contain a coarse, dark staining keratohyalin granules. Then there's the stratum lucidum. The stratum lucidum is only seen in thick skin, so thin skin lacks this layer entirely. It's a thin translucent zone, and it's superficial to the stratum granulosum. The keratinocytes in there are densely packed with elaiodin, which is a clear protein that gives them their clear appearance. The cell have no nuclei or other organelles. This zone has a pale, fairly featureless appearance. And then finally, at the top, the very outermost layer is the stratum corneum. This can be up to 30 layers of dead, scaly, keratinized cells. These are the cells that slough off. They form a very durable outer surface layer. These cells are mostly dead. The surface flakes off or exfoliates. They're resistant to abrasion and penetration and water loss. In some areas, the stratum corneum will be rather thick, like over our heels, and others very thin, like in our eyelids. So close your books, take out a pen and paper, and write down all the different layers of epidermis that you can remember. Doesn't matter if you get them in order at first. You can refer back to your notes once you've tried and asked for some recall. Your brain will be curious. For each of these layers, describe what sorts of cell types are found there, as well as some of the characteristics of each cell. You can use the figure below as a great guide for creating your own diagram here. Let's look now a little bit more at the keratinocytes. We've already established that they're produced deep in the epidermis from stem cells in the stratum basale. Some of the deepest keratinocytes in the stratum spinosum also multiply and increase in their numbers, but as they move towards the surface, there'll be less and less cell division. Most of the mitosis occurs close to the basement membrane because it requires an abundant supply of oxygen and nutrients. And the deeper cells can acquire these nutrients from the nearby blood vessels in the dermis. Once the epidermal cells migrate more than 2 or 3 cells away from the dermis, their mitosis will cease because there's just simply not enough nutrients to support it. The newly formed keratinocytes are going to push the older ones towards the surface, so we're continually regenerating new epidermal layers. It takes about 30 to 40 days for a keratinocyte to make its way to the skin's surface and then flake off. It slows in older age and becomes much faster in skin that's been injured or stressed. For example, calluses or corns are thick accumulations of dead keratinocytes that happen on our hands and feet, usually as a result of stress to the skin. Like I get calluses on my hands when I'm rowing a lot. The calluses form and prevent blisters. The cytoskeleton of keratinocytes is going to proliferate as cells are shoved upwards. And as they're shoved upwards, they become more flat, thus giving the name to the stratified cells in these layers. Once a keratinocyte approaches the stratum granulosum layer, it'll form lipid-filled membrane-coating vesicles called lamellar granules. Once they're in the stratum granulosum, 3 important developments occur. The keratinocyte nucleus and other organelles degenerate, that is, the cells die. So above the stratum granulosum layer, there are no living cells. Also, the keratohyalin granules are going to release a protein called filaggrin. This binds the keratin filaments together into coarse, tough bundles. The membrane-coating vesicles will release their lipid mixture that spreads out over the cell surface. This is how we get the waterproofing in the skin. So this waterproofing layer forms between the stratum granulosum and the stratum spinosum. It consists of lipids that have been secreted by the keratinocyte granules and tight junctions between each of the keratinocytes. There's a thick layer of insoluble protein on the inner surfaces of all these keratinocyte plasma membranes. This epidermal water barrier is critical to retaining water in the body and preventing dehydration. Cells above this water barrier will die pretty quickly. The barrier cuts them off from all the nutrients below. These dead cells dry out and exfoliate and become dander. Dandruffs are clumps of dander that get stuck together by sebum or oil. That's why we often see them in the scalp. So take a moment here to move away from your notes and see what you can do to trace the life history of a keratinocyte from the deepest layer to the most superficial layer of the epidermis. This will help you reinforce your knowledge of the different layers of the epidermis. So now let's dive down into the dermal layer. The dermis is this thick connective tissue layer right beneath the epidermis. It ranges from about 2.2 millimeters in the eyelids to 4 millimeters thick in the palms and the soles. It's composed mainly of collagen with elastic fibers, reticular fibers, as well as fibroblasts. It's well supplied with blood vessels. It contains sweat glands, sebaceous glands, and a multitude of nerve endings. The hair follicles and nail roots are embedded in the dermis. There's smooth muscle called piloerector muscles that act on these hairs in order to contract and during cold cause goosebumps and hairs to stand up on end. The dermal papillae are finger-like projections here of the dermis that grow up into the epidermis. These cause friction ridges on the fingertips, and they're responsible for our fingerprints. In the dermis, there's both a papillary layer and a reticular layer. The papillary layer is the most superficial zone of the dermis. It's a thin zone of mostly areolar tissue in and near the dermal papilla. It allows for mobility of leukocytes and other defense cells should the epidermis become broken. It's rich in small blood vessels. So it's this layer right here, fairly thin relative to the whole epidermis. The reticular layer is the rest of this. It's a deeper and much thicker layer of dermis. It consists mostly of dense, irregular connective tissue. When we see tears in this reticular layer, it causes stretch marks or striae. This sometimes happens during pregnancy or in extreme obesity. Here we can see some micrographs where we see the papillary layer of the dermis projecting up into the epidermis. Here in the deeper layer, you can see a distinct difference in reticular tissue. The hypodermis is this layer beneath the dermis. It's subcutaneous tissue, not technically part of the integument, but there's no better place to address it than in this chapter. It has much more areola and adipose tissue than the dermis. It definitely pads the body and it binds the skin to the underlying tissues. A subcutaneous injection will go into this layer, and because it's highly vascular, the drugs can be absorbed quickly. This is where we hold our subcutaneous fat. It's our energy reservoir, and it's also involved in thermal insulation. It's about 8% thicker in women than it is in men, which accounts for our higher body fat content. So skin color. Melanin's the most significant factor involved in skin color, but it's not the only factor. Again, we know it's produced by the melanocytes, and it accumulates in keratinocytes of the stratum basale and stratum spinosum. Eumelanin is a brownish-black color of melanin, and pheomelanin is a reddish-yellow, more sulfur-containing pigment. People have different skin colors, but they have the same number of melanocytes. The difference is that dark-skinned people produce greater quantities of melanin. The melanin granules in the keratinocytes are more spread out, and the melanin breaks down more slowly. Melanized cells can be seen throughout the epidermis. In light-skinned people, the melanin is clumped near the keratinocyte nucleus. The melanin is broken down much more rapidly, and little is seen beyond the stratum basal. The amount of melanin also varies with the exposure to ultraviolet radiation from sunlight. The amount of melanin also varies with exposure to ultraviolet rays of sunlight. So the more melanin we have in our cells, the more protected the nuclei are from the ultraviolet radiation. There are a couple other factors that affect skin color. One of them is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a red pigment in the red blood cells, and sometimes we'll see a reddish or pinkish hue in the skin. The other is keratin, which is a yellow pigment that we acquire from egg yolks and orange vegetables like carrots. It concentrates in the stratum corneum and in subcutaneous fat, and can certainly have an impact on skin color. There are some abnormal skin colors, of course. Cyanosis, or blueness in the skin, indicates a deficiency of oxygen in the circulating blood. It can result from airway obstruction or lung disease, or from cold weather or cardiac arrest. We also see erythema, which is an abnormal redness in the skin due to dilated cutaneous vessels. It can happen with exercise, hot weather, sunburn, anger, or embarrassment. So not necessarily abnormal, but different. Pallor is a pale or ashen color where there's little or no blood flow through the skin. The white color of the dermal collagen shows through. This comes during emotional stress or low blood pressure, circulatory shock, sometimes during cold, and certainly in anemia. Albinism is a genetic lack of melanin that results in white hair, pale skin, and pink eyes. It's a recessively inherited characteristic, and there's a non-functional allele for tyrosinase, and it prevents the production of melanin. Jaundice is a yellowing of skin and the sclera. It's due to excess bilirubin in the blood, so it can indicate that there's cancer or hepatitis, cirrhosis, or other compromised liver function. A hematoma is simply a bruise. It's a mass of clotted blood that shows through the skin. So you can see from these skin colors that we can tell a lot about an individual's health by the color of the skin. Now, skin color is varied throughout different populations of the world. It's one of the most conspicuous signs in human variation. It results from a combination of evolutionary pressures, especially due to differences in exposure to ultraviolet radiation. Ultraviolet radiation has two adverse effects. It can cause skin cancer, and it also causes the breakdown of folic acid needed for normal cell division, fertility, and development. It has one desirable effect, which is that it stimulates vitamin D synthesis, and that's necessary for dietary calcium absorption. So the skin colors of people in various regions of the world have to do with the balance between how much UV radiation do you need in order to produce enough vitamin C, but not cause skin cancer or break down all the folic acid. So populations native to the tropics and their descendants tend to have very well melanized skin to screen out the excessive ultraviolet radiation. Populations native to far northern or far southern latitudes, when the sunlight is weak, tend to have lighter skin. This allows for adequate ultraviolet radiation penetration. Women have skin averaging about 4% lighter than men in general, and so they need greater amounts of vitamin D and folic acid because they have to support pregnancy and lactation. Of course, high altitudes and dry air will increase the skin pigmentation. We'll see that in populations of the Andes and Tibet and Ethiopia. Ultraviolet radiation accounts for about 77% of the variation in human skin color. There are other exceptions. Migration and cultural differences in clothing and shelter. We'll see intermarriage of people from different geographic ancestries, and we'll see that sexual selection has something to do with it. Some mates prefer darker skin and some prefer lighter skin. So we've definitely seen mixing of skin colors through the past several generations. Finally, let's look at some skin markings. There are friction ridges, which of course bring us fingerprints. Everyone has a unique pattern, and they're formed during fetal development. They remain unchanged throughout life. Not even identical twins have the same fingerprints. It's said that these friction ridges allow us to manipulate small objects. Flexion lines or flexion creases are lines on the flexor surfaces of the digits, palms, wrists, and elbows. These mark the sites where skin folds during flexion of the joints. We'll also see freckles and moles from tan to black, which are aggregations of melanocytes. Freckles are flat and melanized patches. Moles, or nevus, are elevated melanized patches, often with a hair. Moles should be watched for changes in color, diameter, and contour, as this may suggest some skin cancer malignancy. Hemangiomas are birthmarks. They're patches of discolored skin that are caused by benign tumors, that is, non-malignant, of the dermal blood capillaries. Some appear in childhood, others last for a whole life. This concludes the first section of our chapter on the integumentary system.